Chapter 15. Henry sneezed, waited, sneezed again, and squirmed closer to the mouth of whatever it was he was stuck in. At least there was light. Someone was speaking. It was a man's voice, and he ended loudly. People applauded. Henry got his face to the door as the music began and blinked in surprise. He saw what Henrietta had seen, though the dance and song had changed. His eyes followed the swirling colors, ran over the walls and up to the vaulted ceilings, where chains suspended 3 enormous gold candelabras lined with hundreds of flicking tongues of flame. His eyes watered as another sneeze welled up in his head, and he buried his face in his arm to stifle the noise. Then he blinked and looked back into the sparkling hall. "Who's there?" It was a girl's voice. In all the noise, he'd barely even noticed it. Henry didn't say anything. He slid forward and stuck his head out into the room. Instantly, the world was black. He blinked again, waiting for his eyes to adjust. Some moonlight filtered down through the gaped roof, but no roof was visible. Henry scooted back into the cupboard. The laughter, the music, the light, and the noise of the dancing feet all flooded back at once. He squinted and slid forward again, this time clipping his head on the top of the doorway. Darkness. "Who's there?" the voice said again. This time it was the only noise in the room, and it ricocheted off the walls, filling the huge place. "Henrietta?" Henry asked. "Is that you? Where are you?" Henrietta laughed. "Henry? I'm way over here. The floor's all rotten, so I'm a little stuck now that it's dark. Do you have a flashlight?" "Nope," Henry said. He slid all the way out and dropped to the floor. "Richard," he said back into the cupboard. "Richard, come all the way through. What you're seeing isn't real." Richard didn't say anything. "Who's Richard?" Henrietta asked. Henry didn't answer. "Richard? Richard!" "Oh well, it'll be easier without you anyway." Henry turned and looked around the ruined hall. He could see a few stars and dim shapes of the clouds, and he could make out the windows. "Where exactly are you?" "I'm by the balcony." "Where's the balcony?" "Are you by a window? I can only see windows." "I'll try and come to you," Henrietta said. "Just keep making noise. I think I'll have to crawl." Henry sat down with his back to the hutch. "You know you're a complete nut, don't you?" "Takes one to know one," Henrietta said. "Oh, shut up," Henry said. "Why would you go through a cupboard without telling anyone? I had no idea which one you went through." The sound of cracking wood echoed around the hall, followed by clattering one on the story below. "Are you okay?" Henry asked. "Be careful." "I'm fine," Henrietta said. "Close one, though. You were right. It wasn't a dream. There was this little man living in Grandfather's room. I was chasing him. If it helps, I'm glad you came. This place was getting spooky. Eli said it all got wiped out in one night, and the night you can see from inside the cupboard, and now it's haunted." "Who said?" "Eli, the little man. Weren't you listening? He said this place gets freaky after dark." Henry looked at the black shapes of the windows. He was right. "I'm standing up now," Henrietta said. "Can you see me?" "No." Light surged through the hall. Henry yelped and fell to his side. "What's wrong?" Henrietta said. "Oops, I think I need to crawl again." Henry sat up and shaded his eyes. The 3 huge candelabras that he'd seen lighting the dance were all suspended in the air, fully lit. The room was still in complete decay. There wasn't even any ceiling left to hold 2 of the 3 lights. Henrietta was near the end of the room on her hands and knees. She stuck out one hand and felt around the floor for holes, then slid forward carefully and did it again. "Henrietta?" Henry asked. "Yeah?" "Can you see?" She laughed. "I thought my eyes would get used to it, but they didn't. This is crazy dark." "I can see you," Henry said. "I can see everything. The big chandelier lights are on." Henrietta stopped. She was only about 60 feet from Henry. Her eyes were wide, and she turned her head, staring blankly around her. "I'm going to come get you," Henry said. He stood up and looked all over the floor. The larger pits were all near the center of the room, but the distance between where he stood and where Henrietta crawled was littered with smaller gaps and cracks. Henry walked cautiously around the split and sagging wood, trying to keep above beams and supports. Henrietta kept crawling. "Stop," Henry said. "Just wait, I'm halfway there." 6 feet from her, he stepped over the last gap and touched her on the back. She stood, groping blindly for his hands. "Okay, I can kind of see you now," she said. "At least I can see your shape." Henry looked around for an easier way back. Then he heard something. A few notes from a violin. A burst of laughter. Something swished behind him. Henry spun, almost knocking Henrietta over, just in time to watch a dark woman, shorter than he was and wearing a fire-orange gown, swirl past him, arms out, embracing an invisible partner. Her eyes were shut and she was laughing. More and more people appeared, usually dancing alone, occasionally in pairs. The music came rarely and in short bursts. The people danced regardless, breaking the silence of the hall with the rustling of fabric. "What's going on?" Henrietta asked. "I thought I heard something." "The people are dancing," Henry whispered. He shivered. "Come on, I want to get out of here." "I feel sorry for them," Henrietta said. Henry tried to keep his eyes on the dancers and on the floor. Once or twice he collided with one. He had expected to whisk right through him, but he didn't. He felt the bump, though lightly, and then the dancer or dancers would spin away. One even said, "Pardon." Henrietta saw none of it. She clung to Henry's arm and placed her feet nervously wherever Henry told her the floor was strong. When only a third of the distance to the cupboard remained, the ballroom was nearly full, and collisions were almost impossible to avoid. Henry kept his arms out, and the dancers spun off to the sides as they came. "Is that wind?" Henrietta asked. "Yes," Henry said, "the air is moving." He was guiding Henrietta in front of him when the 2 doors at the end of the hall burst open. Henrietta grabbed him. "What was that?" she whispered. "What do you see?" Henry didn't say anything. He and most of the dancers were frozen, staring at the doorway. Through it stepped a tall figure, hooded and cloaked in wolfskin, holding a slender staff taller than he was. At the top, a long, narrow spike rose out of 2 cruel blades that bent back toward the shaft. Broad men, none as tall as the first, swarmed into the room. Then the screaming began. Henrietta could hear it. She dropped out of Henry's grip and covered her ears. Henry stood and watched, and felt that familiar sickness welling in his stomach. Some of the men held lean wolves on chains, and when the tall man gestured, they released them, snarling, into the crowd. The wolves attacked a few, but mostly they herded the dancers to the center of the room. A few still danced alone, and the wolves either did not see them or were unable to touch them. As the people gathered, Henry pulled Henrietta to her feet. Whatever was going to happen next, he didn't want to see it. The hall was filled with screams and weeping, and Henry did not turn around. Henrietta cried while Henry shuffled her toward the wall with the hutch, and as he watched his feet and the floor around them, they saw a man running from a wolf. He was tall, not one of the short people, and he was running toward the hutch. He looked over his shoulder, and Henry blinked. The man had his mother's face. He threw open the cupboard, and the wolf snapped at his feet as he dove inside. When he was gone, the wolf turned, still snarling, and surveyed the room. It looked directly at Henry, raised its hackles, and pulled its lips back. "Silence!" The tall man's voice rose above the din. The broad men all began whistling, and wolves from every corner of the room returned to them. The wolf in front of Henry ran to its handler, guarding the perimeter of what was now a crowd of several hundred gathered on the dance floor. One of the small men broke away from the group and ran for the doors. 2 wolves pulled him down from behind, and the screaming began again. "Silence!" The man's voice was thunder. This time he gestured with his staff, and the great windows exploded into shards, showering the crowd with glass. "You have long kept out the witch queen with your tokens. Nym-Iain now sees that your tokens are gone, and so will you be. We are the witch dogs, and she feeds us well." Henry tried not to listen. He tried not to watch. He pushed and dragged Henrietta to the wall and shoved her into the cupboard. "Hurry," he said. He had to yell as the noise mounted again. "Close your eyes and push through." Henrietta crawled in, but her feet never disappeared. "It won't open for me," she shouted back at him. Henry burrowed in next to her. Okay, scoot to the side as much as you can. When I'm most of the way through, grab onto my legs and crawl after me with your eyes shut. Henry levered himself up, gripped the rope, and tried to pull himself forward. The rope slid toward him. The end was cut cleanly. The two of them lay in the cupboard while wolves howled and glass shattered, while people screamed and men laughed. In the end, the voices were silent. The ceiling crashed and the timbers burned. Dottie jumped up from her chair and ran to the stairs. Penelope and Anastasia followed her up. On the landing, she slowed and looked around. Grandfather's room was still open, but nothing seemed wrong. She looked back and saw both girls behind her holding their breath. "You two, stay," she whispered. She walked softly across the landing and came to Grandfather's halfway open door. She saw Blake, and then she saw Frank's feet. He was lying flat on his back. She stepped closer and pushed on the door. It swung slowly, and she saw Frank's legs, his waist, his chest, his face. His eyes were shut. One arm lay flat, the other was bent, the hand clutching something above his hip. It was his knife. The blade was smeared red. With a gasp, Dottie threw the door open and rushed to him. Dropping to her knees, she grabbed at his throat, feeling for a pulse. "Dorothy," a voice said. Dottie spun and went white when she saw the speaker. The witch was fingering her cat and staring above Dottie's head. She was smiling. "Mom?" Anastasia's voice drifted in the door. "Shh," Penelope said. Dottie tried to yell, to tell them to run. Her tongue was frozen. The witch laughed. "They can't hear you." Her laughter grew and then broke. She coughed. With each hack, her image changed, and Dottie glimpsed what she already knew was there. The shriveled form of a tiny, eyeless hag. Dottie lunged for her feet but landed heavily on the floor. She tried to stand, but a smell like foul eggs surrounded her and she couldn't breathe. She half stood, dizzy, and her knees gave. Her elbows went limp. "Run," she whispered. Anastasia and Penelope had seen their mother hurry into Grandfather's room. All they heard was laughter and then coughing. "Mom?" Anastasia said again. Penelope bit her lip. A woman like they had never seen emerged from the doorway, smiling sadly and carrying a cat. Both girls stepped back, and Anastasia grabbed Penelope's arm. The woman was dressed heavily as if for the cold, with a gray cloak. But her throat was bare. It was a long throat and delicate. The face above it was just as rich as it was fine, the olive skin as smooth as it was warm. She was beautiful. Her cheeks were high and her nose long. How Anastasia thought a queen's should be. A queen in any land, in any country. "Children," she said softly, "your father has been winded, but your mother is tending him." Penelope swallowed loudly. "Who are you?" "I'm called Nym-Iain. I'm a friend of your father's from another place. He has asked for my help. It is important. There was a boy. Do you know where he is?" "Henry?" Anastasia asked. "He's lost in the cupboards." "Can we see our parents?" Penelope asked. "Soon enough," Nym-Iain said. "Show me these cupboards. Are they the small gateways in the room above?" "Mom," Penelope called, "can we come in?" "Hush, hush," Nym-Iain said. "We must leave them for a few moments." She tried to look at Penelope's face but missed, looking just above her head. "Your cat looks sick," Anastasia said. The woman turned her face toward Anastasia. "Yes, he has been sick for some time, but I am able to keep him alive." Anastasia stared into the cat's eyes. Then she looked up at the woman's perfect face. "What's wrong with your eyes?" she asked. "Why don't you look at us?" "My eyes are strong," Nym-Iain said, her tone suddenly harsh. It softened quickly. "I have a little magic, and I do not always need to look in order to see. Now will you take me to these cupboards? I would ask you about them." Anastasia stepped to the attic stairs, but Penelope didn't budge. "We'll stay down here," she said. "Your father asked that we hurry," the woman said. "This boy Henry is not in a pleasant place." "Come on," Anastasia said. "We'll come back in a second." "Mom," Penelope said, "we're going into the attic. We'll be right back." Anastasia stood at the top of the stairs and waited. Nym-Iain waited for Penelope to climb first. When Nym-Iain did move onto the stairs, she held the cat low, and her steps were not smooth. In the attic, Anastasia pulled the 2 doors open and stepped into Henry's room. "Oh, I forgot about Richard," she said. "He's still asleep." The witch walked into the room behind her. "Who's Richard?" Penelope hung back, but then she saw Richard's face. His flesh was gray. A purple blotch stood out on his forehead. "He doesn't look asleep," she said. "Is he okay?" She slid past the woman's robes and put her hand on his cheek. "He's cold." "His sleep is merely deep," the woman said. Penelope put her fingers against Richard's neck. "His heart is barely beating." Nym-Iain raised her head and sniffed. "These are all the gateways?" "What about Richard?" Anastasia asked. The woman turned on her sharply, then slowed herself and smiled. She stretched out a slender arm to touch Richard. "There it is," Penelope said. "It's beating faster now." Nym-Iain turned back to the cupboards. "These cupboards, how are they used?" "I thought you were from one," Anastasia said. "Yes," the woman said. "I found the way in. It was very small, but I passed into the darkness to question some of the eldest, and it was my own father who told me how to pass through the small ways. So I have come, and so I will go. But the boy Henry must have another way. He could not know such magic." "We don't know how it works," Penelope said. "We've never done it. Mom just told us that Henry and Henrietta were stuck in them." "I think you spin the knobs on the middle one," Anastasia began. Penelope shot up her eyebrows behind the witch's back and shook her head. Anastasia stopped. Penelope was backing slowly toward the door. "Go on," the witch said. "That's it," Anastasia shrugged. "I think you spin the middle ones." Nym-Iain shifted her cat, lifting it higher, and then stretched out a hand, running it over the doors. "Childish," she said. "So clumsy. You are behind one of these, young pauper son? The blood of Mordecai hidden in a cupboard?" She raised her hand and spoke in a strange, rough tongue. The doors all flew open and Anastasia's ears popped. Penelope grabbed Anastasia by the wrist and dragged her out of the room. They reached the top of the stairs too quickly and slid most of the way down on their backs. "Children!" the woman cried. But they hit the landing, staggering into a run. The black cat dashed between them. "Mom!" Penelope yelled. "Mom!" The 2 of them burst into Grandfather's room. The cat was with them. Anastasia ran into the bed while Penelope slid to the floor. Blake rose from where he had been sitting by Dottie's head and charged the sickly cat, yowling. Dottie lay crumpled on her side next to Frank. Her skin was pale and her lips were blue. "Mom?" Anastasia said. "Penelope, are they dead?" The black cat retreated to the landing, and Blake followed. Penelope crawled to her parents. She didn't answer. The 2 sisters could hear footsteps on the attic stairs. Anastasia rushed to the door. "She's coming, Penelope." "Shut it," Penelope said, but Anastasia didn't. "Shut it," she said again. "Blake, come here." Anastasia turned and grabbed Blake by the loose skin on his neck, hurried into the room and shut the door behind her. Then she stuck her finger in the doorknob hole and pulled. The door wouldn't open. Penelope pressed her fingers into her mother's neck. After a moment, she moved to her father. "They're alive," she said. "Can you hear anything?" Anastasia stuck her ear to the door. Penelope rolled Dottie onto her back and brushed her mother's hair out of her face. Dottie's eyes were open, but her pupils were no more than tiny points. "No," Anastasia whispered. "I can't." Then she jumped back, tripped on Frank's foot, and fell on the floor. The door rattled in its frame.